Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're looking at the final election prediction for the 2025 New York City mayoral race. Now, the only map I could find for the New York City race is the borough district and such, but I wanted to use a map just to kind of show the race itself. So I'm just using the state of New York for this one, but for today's video, we're looking at the New York City mayoral race right down here, and we're looking at who is going to win and be the next mayor of New York City. Will it be Democrat Zohran Mamdani, Republican Curtis Sliwa, or independent candidate Andrew Cuomo? Well, today's video, we're going to break all of that down. So the New York City mayoral race. Right now in the polling data, Zohran Mamdani is leading in pretty much every single poll by around 15 percentage points. Now, just to give you an idea of this, the rating system I use is 1 point or under is tilt, lean is 1 to 5 points, likely is 5 to 15, and everything that's over 15 or more points in the margin of victory is considered a safe win. So you can do the math here. Zohran Mamdani is polling right around a safe Democratic win. Now, Zohran Mamdani, if you've not been following this race, is the Democratic Assemblyman that won his Democratic primary against Andrew Cuomo in sort of a shocking victory at the time. Cuomo was massively outspending Zohran Mamdani. Cuomo was a much larger name. Mamdani's campaign started out with pretty much nothing, and Mamdani was able to get a lot amount of support, heavily bolstered by a lot of young Democratic voters. And a lot of them turned out for Mamdani in the primary, and he ultimately ended up winning by a very, very large margin, ultimately winning 56.39% to 43.6%. When it looked like in the final days of the polling data that it was possible Andrew Cuomo would be leading in most of the polls, and then maybe if Mamdani were to win, he would nearly eke out a victory on the last part of it, whereas it was completely flipped. In the first round, the initial voting, Mamdani led 43.82 to Cuomo's 36.12 and ultimately ended up winning 56.39 to 43.61. So Mamdani certainly coming out of pretty much nowhere and winning this Democratic primary against the former Democratic governor of the state of New York was very, very significant. Now, as we went to the general election, the questions were always going to be, well, okay, who can take on Zohran Mamdani and potentially win? And Andrew Cuomo decided to launch a third-party campaign as an independent after early polling showed him as the best alternative in polling to Zohran Mamdani. Now, the Republicans did nominate Curtis Sliwa, their nominee from 2021, and it did not go too well for Curtis Sliwa against Eric Adams back in 2021, though this is a different race. In the last one, Eric Adams really blew Curtis Sliwa out of the water in this race. Adams got 67.4%, Curtis Sliwa got 27.9%. So obviously New York City, a very heavily Democratic area, and likely going to be a Democratic area for a very long time. Now, this race for 2025 is a little bit different, though, because you have Zohran Mamdani, who is a Democrat. Now, he's a Democrat that appeals certainly to the farther left wing of the party. Notable figures you'd be familiar with, like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, those types of Democrats. He really has the support of both of them and has really gotten the support of them really since the beginning. Now, Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York, would be the Democrat to get the appeal of the traditional establishment Democratic Party, and also a lot of Democratic leaders and business leaders in New York City that are concerned with some of the far left policies that Zohran Mamdani has talked about in the campaign of him wanting to do if he becomes elected mayor. So really, essentially, it's a two-person race between Mamdani and Cuomo on the side of who is getting that Democratic vote that Eric Adams got back in 2021. Now, Curtis Sliwa, he is getting still around 16 to 17% of the vote in the current polling averages. Now, Sliwa is running as a Republican, but really when you look at the polling numbers, he's only really playing spoiler in this race. He's never had a chance at winning this at the general election level. New York City is such a Democratic area, and in this three-person race, he really has no shot. And even when it goes to a two-person race of, say, Mamdani versus Sliwa, if Cuomo dropped out for some reason, Sliwa, though he does lose by less than he did to Eric Adams back in 2021, he's still losing by over 20 points in pretty much every single poll that does that matchup. Curtis Sliwa running as the Republican, but he really has no chance in this race. So it became very apparent early on that the only way this race would get competitive is if it became a two-person matchup between Zohran Mamdani and Andrew Cuomo. going all the way back to the beginning here. And looking back into July, you see these numbers initially with Mamdani versus Cuomo in a head-to-head 1v1 matchup. It actually showed a pretty competitive race that Andrew Cuomo, in a lot of instances, was leading. Now, as we're getting closer into the fall and past Labor Day, it's become very apparent Zohran Mamdani has been leading in this race and has not really ever looked back. The two most recent polls in this race are Beacon Research, Shaw and Company. This is the Fox News poll in Marist University. Now, Fox News poll does not show specifically a head-to-head matchup of Mamdani versus Cuomo, but Marist University does. And it shows that if Mamdani and Cuomo faced off, it'd be 50 to 43 advantage Mamdani, with still about 2% saying other and 5% undecided. Which shows that, yes, if it was a two-person race between Mamdani and Cuomo, it would be a lot closer, but even then, Zohran Mamdani would still start out with 50% of the vote, showing that he has come a long way from back in June and July, where he was starting in the high 30% and in a head-to-head matchup against Andrew Cuomo, losing in some instances. Now in the head-to-head matchup, which is supposed to benefit Andrew Cuomo, Zohran Mamdani still starts out as the leader and the favorite in that race. Now for Emerson as well, it does not necessarily go into that same regard, but it shows Mamdani already breaking 50% of the vote. So even if it were to be head-to-head, it wouldn't really even matter if in this current matchup, Mamdani is already breaking 50%. You can look at pretty much every single poll that's come out in the last 2 weeks or so. The trend is still very consistent. Zohran Mamdani has a clear commanding lead on this race. The only way this race would possibly get competitive would have been if Curtis Sliwa dropped out of the race and supported Andrew Cuomo. Eric Adams, the the Democratic mayor who switched to be an independent, ran for re-election as an independent, already dropped out of this race and endorsed Andrew Cuomo, but still Adams was not polling with a very high percentage of numbers. It rose Andrew Cuomo's numbers from like 26% up to 30%, but there's not enough vote out there between Cuomo and Mamdani to make it a close race with Curtis Sliwa in the race. Now, Curtis Sliwa and Andrew Cuomo and Zohran Mamdani, Curtis Sliwa has actually focused most of his attention on going after Andrew Cuomo more so than Zohran Mamdani, which is a very interesting development in this race. There were questions earlier on at the end of September, start of October, of would Curtis Sliwa drop out and support Andrew Cuomo? So much so that it seemed Curtis Sliwa was going after Cuomo more and going in support of Zohran Mamdani more than Andrew Cuomo in terms of how much he was campaigning against Cuomo and pointing out some of Cuomo's past controversies. So this race has been very clear. It is a three-person race between Mamdani, Cuomo, and Sliwa. And when it's split up this way, Democrat Zohran Mamdani getting around 46% of the vote, even with the amount of undecided vote left out there, which is still about 7%, there's just not enough vote left out there with Cuomo and Sliwa both in the race to get a very close result where Mamdani could possibly lose. If that were to be the case, pretty much all that undecided vote would have to go to Andrew Cuomo, and the polls would have to be majorly wrong. Like Curtis Sliwa getting 16% would only have to be getting like 8% or something for this to even become remotely close, which shows the reality of the race, which is that Zohran Mamdani has run, whatever you think of him politically, he has run a very impressive campaign against a former Democratic governor of New York and former Democratic primary opponent and their former Republican nominee from 2021. And at this point, against these two men, he is running away with this race, breaking that 15% safe barrier to be a safe win for the young Democratic candidate. Now, this obviously could have big ramifications across the country for other Democrats trying to run in competitive primaries like Zohran Mamdani and potentially for the 2026 midterm elections. But for that to happen, he has to win this one first. And based on the polling data, it looks increasingly likely Zohran Mamdani will be the next mayor of New York City. And ultimately, the numbers show in this chart here essentially how that goes. First, I'll turn off the confidence interval here. It never really looked like after Cuomo lost the primary that this was going to be a very competitive race. Once Cuomo lost, Mamdani took the lead in the polling average, and Mamdani never looked back. Now, at this point, this is some of the most competitive it's been since about the middle part of July, but still, a 15, 16-point lead or so from Mamdani over Cuomo. Mamdani's nearing 50% despite the fact that it's a three-person race, and Cuomo, with Sliwa getting about 16% of the vote, there's just simply not enough math out there to potentially sway this race. When you look at the confidence interval here and you see, is there any purple overlap where Cuomo is reaching up to Mamdani's numbers, even on the high end or lower end of the polling numbers for Mamdani once you take in the margin of error to effect here. Is there any point in which Cuomo matches Zohran Mamdani's numbers? That has not been the case since about July. So again, for this race not to go to Zohran Mamdani, the polls have to be like not wrong. They have to be worse than like 2016 levels of wrong for Andrew Cuomo to defeat Zohran Mamdani in this race based on the polling data that we have. So ultimately, I am obviously expecting a win for Zohran Mamdani over Andrew Cuomo. The question is going to be by how much. Now, I'm personally in the final few days of the campaign. I thought we'd see this race narrow up a little bit and fall under 15 points, and I am still going to narrowly give that margin. I'm giving Zohran Mamdani the win in the likely Democratic margin. Now, what does that ultimately translate to? Well, I showed it at the start of the video a little bit. I think that we're going to see Zohran Mamdani win in the borough of Manhattan, in Queens, and in Kings. I think we're going to see all three, and then we're going to see, this is Brooklyn as well, just to be clear, this is Brooklyn, and this is Queens. I think we see all three of these go for Zohran Mamdani. Now, there's going to be vote splitting, so it's going to be a little difficult here to be 100% for sure, but I think Curtis Sliwa would have enough votes to win down here in Staten Island and Richmond County, New York. I think we're going to see Curtis Sliwa still win here despite the vote splitting. It may be a closer margin than it was in 2021, but I think we're going to see that. Now, as for the Bronx, Andrew Cuomo did very well here in the Democratic primary, and I think in the general election, that should be more favorable to Cuomo than the primary in terms of getting votes in this one. I think we're actually going to see the Bronx nearly go for Cuomo, but I expect that to be a close race as well. Just to give you an idea of how these boroughs did vote. Now, for 2021, when it was Adams versus Sliwa, Sliwa did win Staten Island about 66.5 to 28.8. So with the vote splitting of Cuomo and Mamdani, I think it'll be closer, but I think Curtis Sliwa can still win there. Whereas Brooklyn voted heavily for Adams in Queens, heavily for Adams in Manhattan, and heavily for Adams in the Bronx. Now for the Democratic primary in 2025, we saw Andrew Cuomo win Staten Island, but not by a very large margin, 46-38. But still, this is a more heavily Republican area, the Democratic area. But Cuomo did win there, and Cuomo won the Bronx 52-34. The fact that Cuomo broke 50% in the Democratic primary, to me says, all right, he has a chance to win it in the general election. When you look at the other areas of New York City, like Manhattan, Zohran Mamdani won 39%, Andrew Cuomo got 34%. So Manhattan was very, very close. And I'm anticipating of the three boroughs, the closest one to be Manhattan for the general election. Now, Brad Lander, the other Democrat candidate who was sort of allies with Zohran Mamdani, did get 17% of the vote. So ultimately, how that goes to the general election is going to be interesting to watch because a lot of those voters would probably have voted for Zohran Mamdani instead of Andrew Cuomo. So that could be something interesting to watch for. But I do think this is going to be a little bit competitive. I wouldn't be shocked if Manhattan itself is under 15 points, but I think we're going to see Mamdani win there. Queens voted for Mamdani 46-38. I think this one we're going to see vote for Zohran Mamdani over Andrew Cuomo. And Brooklyn voted 49-31, the largest margin of the three. I think this one goes for Mamdani over Cuomo in the general election. So ultimately, when everything is said and done, I think we get a map that looks like this, where Kings and Queens go around 15 points, maybe a little bit more for Mamdani over Cuomo. Manhattan itself votes for Mamdani by a few points under 15 points. And then we see Staten Island go for Sliwa and the Bronx go for Andrew Cuomo. That's how I currently have the race going at this current point in time in the final election prediction for 2025 for the New York City mayoral race. After months and weeks of coverage, this is the final prediction of Zohran Mamdani winning by a little bit under 15 points, but not by all that much. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you did, leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts, and I hope to see you in a future video.